Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about pregnancy, birth, and childhood to give us some ideas of the historical and theological background of our understandings of childhood and how it's playing out in the contemporary U.S. experience. All right, so a lot of this historical backdrop I'm going to offer you today comes from Centuries of Childhood, a book by Philip Aris. It really looks at a lot of the changes in the notion of family over time that have happened, especially children's role within this capacity. So onward we go. Just to begin, age really varied by time and place, not to say biological age and that sort of thing varied, but our social understanding of age. A lot of times we believe that we just have these biological understandings of age, but we don't really see the way that we have social understanding of age as well. A lot of times this didn't correspond to a chronological age so much as a social age. So if people were really learned, for example, in paintings they were portrayed as long bearded men and balding, even if they were very young at the time. It was a matter of depicting them and their knowledge and showing signs of aging because in that culture, in that instance, it was considered a sign of wisdom. Aging was considered a sign of wisdom. And so, for example, let's look at the Greco-Roman culture. They had childhood that existed until 7, Puritia, which was till they were 14. Your adolescence, it kind of varied, sometimes depending on the time or place. It was until you were 21, 28, 30, or as late as 35. Your adolescence was you were believed to be in adolescence, and then you got to enter youth at this point, so you're still young and vital until 45 or 50, and then you entered senectitude or gravity, and then finally more of a biological line than a social line was old age. And so this wasn't really chronological as far as how old you were when you entered it. It was when your body started to kind of fall apart, when your bladder and your mind would go. It was considered very unseemly, and people didn't want to live into old age due to this because of their cultural understandings of the human body and its capacities. And in France, childhood, youth, and old age they only had 3 ways of understanding, and even child implied as your ability to sit. So you didn't really have an experience of personhood until you got to that point. It wasn't until the 19th century that they borrowed the term bébé from our English word baby to talk about these very young pre-sitting humans. And then there are privileged age. Then each of these cultures have different times when you're privileged. What do you consider your prime in? Youth in the West, it typically was youth in the 17th century. And then childhood in the 19th century, when you were at this ideal sort of time. And then adolescence in the 20th century. And we'll see where this might be headed as we enter a new era. There were no children in art, quote unquote. You'll see why. Children might have been in art in the beginning. When I'm talking, pre 14th century, children were often depicted as small adults. They weren't really seen as their own category. They were just miniaturized version of adults. From the 14th century on, though, this began to change. There were more frequent depictions of Mary with her child Jesus, and this made people want to have this more infantile, affectionate person. So yeah, we'll see that Jesus began as a mini adult, looking very solemn and priestly. The shape did not change so much as, but a holding of the affection of the mother came, and these depictions slowly began to look more and more like children, and would display profane scenes. Profane just meaning ordinary scenes from everyday life, not sacred scenes. Scene and that sort of things, just to understand. So if you look at this picture, it's really interesting. This is a pre-14th century painting, and it looks like, as Mary holding a fussy baby, but it really looks like she's holding a grumpy mini man. Jesus is not affectionately touching his mother's face, so much as he's like pushing her away, it looks like, from the look on his face. And he doesn't look like he's swaddled and affectionate. He's kind of like kicking out of his bundlings, and he's got ripped muscles. It's not very much like a child. And we see this changing over time. Jesus in this 12th century piece isn't even interested in his mother, doesn't see that she's there, is kind of reaching out, and you can see how he looks like a young man, miniaturized. He still has this kind of miniaturized version of an adult in this 14th century one, but he's reaching towards his mother, and that little slit in her dress, that was something that women in those days wore, was a slit that they could put over their nipples so they could breastfeed discreetly. So you can see him reaching for the food, as it were. And then finally in the 16th century, we see very much a child, this like Jesus sitting on top of a lamb, chubby little guy, doesn't look like an adult at all, definitely looks like a child. So this is when children get to have their own sort of place in art in the beginning. The reasons that art included children were really twofold. First of all, they were just part of the adult world. Right now, in our American way of doing things, we don't really have a place where adults and children come together. It's like children go to school while the parents go to work, if children go to daycare, these sorts of things. But before, children were just a part of the adult world. They were a part of work, they were a part of leisure, they were a part of sport, unlike today. And children were also, so it wasn't only just this reflected the reality, it was just that children were also considered more aesthetic. This painting in particular is from 1556. This is a close-up of a much bigger painting on some kids that were in the background. But yeah, so children were just there to also brighten up the painting, as it were. So those were the two main reasons. But people didn't have art of their children before the 17th century. The reason for this, because if a child became an adult, why would you hang on to this unfinished image, right? Children were seen as unfinished. They were processes, not products. Right? The final product was the adult. So why would we hang on to this unfinished image of this person? Also, if the child died, it wasn't worthy of remembrance. Death was a real problem. It was very prominent. So why would we hang on to this image of this child? It was just something that was going to remind us of this unfinished person. And you can see this also in an example. There was a mother who had just given birth, and she was already the mother of 5, quote, little brats, according to this rendition of the story. But the doctor told her, in order to console her, before they are old enough to bother you, you will have lost half of them, or perhaps all of them. This is what he said. She didn't know how she was going to handle this new child. And in the 17th century, which is when we see this shift. This is how people consoled mothers that don't worry. But today, compare it to what we say today. If you see a mom who's like, how do I take care of all these kids? You'd say, they might drive you crazy, but at least they're healthy. It's exactly the opposite sort of thing. So we have this very different image of children and their place in society pre-17th century than we do once the 17th century hits and beyond. We're going to see how this changes a little bit. And the 16th century marks the beginning of including dead children on family tombs. Dead children are usually marked by more distant, smaller. They're placed in when they are put on a family sculpture, like a relief and that sort of thing, if they're engraved on the side of the family tomb. Or they're holding crosses or skulls to denote that they died in their childhood. Sometimes dead children's would-be ages were listed, and they were depicted at their age of death. So on the family tomb, they might have said, oh yeah, this person is 40, but then they would be depicted as a 7-year-old because that was when they died. The 17th century marked the beginning of family portraits, that people wanted to include their children, and while they were still children, they really wanted to preserve these moments of childhood rather than get through them so that they could become real people. Photography replaced the family painting in the 19th century. And so, yeah, families finally became interested in preserving their children as children. And so, and this is a 17th century painting. Um, and we see the children are laughing and expressive and looking towards the painting, kind of inviting us in. It's this warm, cheery moment. Dad looks very proud. He's got his arm around his kid. Everyone looks quite nice in this little family portrait. Here's another interesting family portrait I came across, and it looks very, other than the fact that it's filled with many, many children, it looks pretty typical of what you'd think at first, and this is what this art museum thought for a long time. This was just a typical family portrait. However, one day they had some people standing in front of it as a sort of, it was some sort of fundraiser, I believe, for the museum, and then the way the flash hit the painting in the background illuminated this woman in the background. If you can see the arrows pointing at her, and there's like this kind of ghostly type figure. We'll go back to this regular painting. What they think was that this was originally his other wife, who had died probably, and so she was originally a part of this painting. And then when he got remarried, rather than commissioning a whole nother portrait, he just had his old wife painted over. Don't ever do that. And his new wife painted in. So very interesting way of preserving the family and including new members. There she is again. Growing influence, and then there's this growing influence of religion that coincides at this time. This is part of what makes the child a more integral part of the family. There is this, first of all, we have to go get past this myth of past piety. There's this idea in our heads that the past was far more religious than it is today, that everyone was just very much on board with whatever the church said, and they were very pious and very frequented church a lot and that sort of thing. That's a real myth. Religion has always waxed and waned within cultures. So there's this point before the 17th century where we weren't collectively, as far as European society goes, we weren't very pious as a society. But religion begins to gain prominence and influence. And so this is what starts making the child more important. So just to give you an idea of some examples of the myth of past piety, let's dissolve that. A lot of people believed very unorthodox things. Europe was Christian at this point, Protestant and Catholic. Protestantism was fairly new at this point. They believed in life after death. Their understandings of life after death, a lot of people had ideas of reincarnation, or they weren't sure if there was any life after death, to heretical versions of the Trinity, either being that no, God is all one, or no, God is three very distinct beings, more of a tritheism than a monotheism. So people had all kinds of different beliefs that were not on board with Christianity. There was a nun who, in her travels throughout Europe, stopped in at a church. And again, Mass was all in Latin in these days. And so, but there was a priest who did not know how to say the Mass at all. And all he did was say in Latin the Hail Mary over and over and over and over again from the beginning of the Mass to the end of the Mass. And so it's very interesting for us to realize this. But then suddenly, this was a time when Christianity actually began to hold more sway over people's non-theological beliefs as well, such as the value of the soul of the child. A lot of people thought that the child became a more intrinsic part of society and family once they stopped dying out. But this is not the case. Actually, the role of the child and the importance of the child rises a lot earlier than the death toll. A lot earlier than the death toll becomes under control. So it's really, we see the value of the child coming when Christianity gets a stronger hold on people's beliefs, especially surrounding their understanding of the value of the soul of the child. All right, and so just to look at some of these markers, the importance of clothing for denoting where you were in your path to childhood is something that was really important. We don't have a lot of documentation for most children of those era, but as far as Louis XIII goes, we've got a lot of stuff on Louis XIII. His historian followed him around and documented all kinds of stories. So they had different clothing was marked different rites of passages. So in the very beginning of your infancy, you would wear long dresses, whether you were a boy or a girl. It just became, you didn't move, so it didn't hamper your movement. It kept you warm all the way down because the dress would come past your feet. It was very easy to change diapers because you could just lift it up, change, and put it back down. And then it became short dresses so that you could do walking and crawling and that sort of thing. Then it became leading strings. Leading strings were like little strings that were attached to the wrist so that you could, without a lot of people, if you see them with their young children, they might let their children grab their fingers. That gets really hard on the back after a while. So they would have these leading strings and tie to the children's wrist and help them walk in that way. And then you would lose the leading strings. And then you get breeches, which were kind of like your big boy panties or your big girl panties. And then finally, his bonnet is removed from his hat. That was around when he was 7 years old, I believe. And then it was replaced with a man's hat. This was like his final losing of his last piece of childhood clothing. However, the queen takes his hat away and replaces it with a bonnet 6 days later. She was not quite ready for him to come out of childhood. Little girls and boys at this point were dressed identically until they were around 5 or 6, which is to say they were dressed effeminately. They shared that social world as well. This didn't change until after World War I, actually. Little girls' clothes looked more like a woman's at this point, but boys looked more childish. So little girls really inhabited a more adult world than boys. They were very much expected to be little women as far as their role around the house and that sort of thing. And little boys were expected to be more like little boys, and not because a lot of women's work took place around the home, and so girls had access to helping that. Whereas a lot of men's and boys' work, a lot of men's work took place outside the house, so it was hard for boys to participate in that. Lower class children, though, had a life much more enmeshed with adults, and they often wore their clothes, wore their same style of clothes, and worked and played with them. So it was different depending on what class structure you were in. As far as games and hobbies goes, 7 was often seen as the age to abandon childhood. It often wasn't so stark in reality. Oftentimes it was a more gradual sort of transition. Children tend to be more conservative in society as far as what the toys that they hold on to. Like, for example, pinwheels, those are the things you blow into and spin around. Those came from the mill, right, when we used to have mills everywhere. When we used to get around on horses as a method of transportation, this is what the rocking horse comes from, right? So we have children kind of preserve these elements of society that are archaic and no more, but children still participate in them through their toys. So they also emulate the world of adults. Children try to copy whatever is going on in the adult world, but adults try to give them relics of the past that they no longer use. Typically, children who were 3 or 4 and younger had their own games that were very simple, with simple rules. And think about like games like War and Candyland and those sorts of things, just where you're comparing two numbers. But if you were 5 and up, you played the same games as adults and with adults. And that included gambling for money, whatever it was. If you got the game, you were with the adults as far as play goes. This is to emphasize that children and adults shared a world, not just in the matter of helping parents as they could, but also a world of leisure. Parents and adults played games a lot more than people do today. The time that they spent at work, although their work was very tiresome and took a lot of energy and effort, it didn't take as much time. They didn't have electricity to get them in the winter months to light their ways and that sorts of thing. So when the sun set, and it really was a matter of, the work was done, and it was done far before sunset was as well. So they had lots of time to participate in games with one another. And as this painting shows, it's got these people spinning hoops. There's hide and seek. There's jumping barrels. There's leapfrog. A bunch of stuff that I don't know what it is. So yeah, so they played hide and seek as well. They played blind man's buff, and they gambled for money. It was a lot of fun for everyone, and it was games taking up all this time weren't just leisure. It also created a really intense community bonding, bringing people together in these fun ways. I remember reading Little House on the Prairie with my daughter, and they would talk about having spelling bees, and these sorts of things, and adults would compete with one another, and it was a real fun thing to do. Think before TV, people needed to entertain themselves, and so games were the best way to do that. Dancing was also communal. It wasn't coupled at this point. When you think about waltz and those sorts of things, those were balls that the upper class did. The vast majority of people, especially peasants, were always dancing communally. And children either participated alongside the adults and were integrated into it, or they had their own circles where they're doing the same sort of dances together. And that was just because sometimes it's hard to twirl yourself under a child's arm if you're an adult. It's very difficult to bend down that low sometimes. There was a minority of elite, of the wealthy or the aristocrats and whatnot, who considered many games immoral. But the majority, even of the elite, the majority of them thought it was fine. Games, dancing, some considered bad and tolerated for adults, but not for children of this minority. Kids could only play good games that would allow them to grow in virtue and that sort of thing. Certainly not gambling and that such. Here's some more art just to show you what peasant pastimes were like. We see the communal dancing in the upper right-hand corner. You see some folks taking a break at the pub. And from the dancing, they're sitting down and enjoying some mead or whatever it is. And then you see two young kids right next to them. There's no idea that this is an inappropriate place for children. They're just hanging out together. And then there, in the lower right, you see some people dancing, and a child is included in this. And it's not coupled, right? It's a group dance. So yeah, and this was very common in this type of culture, this time of culture. And then there were changes. Slowly, adults began to abandon children's games. They saw them as children's games rather than just games. And children followed. Children stopped taking interest in the game because it was no longer connected to the world of adults. Lower class adults retained their games, but this distanced the world of upper and lower class adults, right? So yes, the lower class adults were still playing the games, which allowed lower class kids to feel a part of the games. But suddenly now upper and lower class adults do not have anything that binds them, and then upper class can say, oh, they're so childish, look at the way they play these games that are for children. When only a generation prior, it was just games that everyone played. It's very interesting how we moved from a very immodest world to a world where we believed that children were very innocent. Louis XIII would often walk around and talk about his cock as public amusement. I forget who he was betrothed to. Let's call her Princess Sarah. But he had this girl he was betrothed to, and they would say, can you show us Princess Sarah's jewels? Where are her treasures? Or that sort of thing. And he'd say, it's my cock. And he would lift up his dress that he was wearing or pull down his breeches, and he would show his penis, and everyone would laugh. And it was like, ha, 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 so funny. And then one day someone did that after his 7th birthday, and he got a good slap for it. Suddenly something that was public amusement became something that was completely inappropriate for Louis to do. There was no reserve for people initially as far as their language goes and how vulgar they were going to be in the presence of children. They were just seen as part, again, of the adult world. They were not presumed innocent. However, in the 17th century, this changes, and it changes fairly abruptly, where children are being compared with angels, and we need to preserve them from the immorality of the world and that sort of thing, and keep them in their innocent phase that they have. And this gives rise to the cult of purity. Parents must ensure protection of this innocence that their children have. And children at the same time this is all, you can read these like in parenting books of the time and that sort of thing. Children must never be left alone, it was told. You're supposed to display it as love of their companionship, that you just want to hang out with them and spend time with them. It's not supposed to be understood by the child as supervision, so that they love your presence around them rather than despising it and seeing you as the regulator and the fun ender. Children were also believed that they shouldn't be pampered at this point. And they also had to learn modesty. They were expected to conceal their bodies, have only one child to a bed, as opposed to a whole, instead of having a large mattress where you could just throw the whole litter. One to a bed became the rule. And they must abandon familiarity with their parents and have respect be the primary focus of the parent-child relationship. Let the children come was also really interesting. Initially, in the medieval period, before the 17th century, the art depicts Jesus and the kids alone. It's just this which is what goes on in the biblical text. It's kids wanting to see Jesus, the apostles saying, no, he's too busy. And then Jesus says, let the children come. And then he hangs out with them. But by the end of the 16th century, we have mothers presenting their children to Jesus. People must have looked at this art and saw this Lord of the Flies thing happening. Why are these children all by themselves? They need to be taken care of. What kind of parents were these people of first century Palestine? So this really indicates the rising importance of family as far as that goes. Jesus is then depicted as smiling and attentive with the children. It's their tenderness and the amusement, which really corroborates the sentiments of the day of what children were and what sort of attitudes and emotions you should lend them. And let's look at some art here. So we have some that's a little earlier. The one on the left is a little from on the earlier side, and you see Jesus with the kids. This is kind of a transitional piece. And at the same time, though, it's not just Jesus and the kids, because we see a mom leading her child up from the distance, coming in. But on the right, it's very much this we're out of the phase where Jesus can ever be hanging out with kids. What were these negligent mothers doing? That sort of thing. And we see infants who never could have expressed an interest in hanging out with Jesus being presented to him by their mothers. Some mothers seem to be like pushing their children towards Jesus. And so you're going to see this very different attitude about children and mothers' role in the children's life, parents' role in the children's life, we see it being expressed in art of this time as well. Another thing that we can see, this increasing importance of children in the life of the community, is in the First Communion ritual. Around the 16th or 17th century, previous to this, it was just something that someone suddenly does one day with the adults. Someone says, hey, you're 7, or you're 8, or whatever, you're old enough, do you want to take communion today? And they're like, oh, okay. And it was just something that you did as an individual. Now, at this point, around the 16th or 17th century, it's something that is prepared for. There's classes that are expected of adults and children, and it's communally celebrated. It was very rigorously prepared for. If anyone remembers their first communion, if you didn't go to a Catholic school, there was lots of stuff that you had to do. You would learn it if you went to a Catholic school. You learned it as part of your second grade curriculum. But if you did not go to a Catholic school, there were lots of classes that you had to take on weekends or after school and that sort of thing. They were often, people would give the child a gift of some sort of sacred nature, like a rosary or their own Bible, that sort of thing, were given. And in the 19th century, there was a special dress expectation that was prepared. It became the childhood ceremony. Yeah, absolutely. Celebrating contradictory, both childhood innocence and this like beauty and purity of the child, as well as this natural, rational appreciation of sacred mysteries on the other hand. which, those are in contradiction with each other. If something is totally innocent and unmarred of the ways of the world, but yet very rational and can appreciate this, the fact that Jesus is truly present in this Eucharist. And we also see, young girls are definitely emphasized within this communion ritual. As you can see here, these are late 1800s, early 1900s art depicting, and you don't really see, it's almost like boys didn't exist, boys didn't get First Communion, I don't know, but you can see that there's all these girls in these long white dresses, which is the typical dress even to this day, and many are veiled, all are veiled actually, and but yeah, where are the boys? But yeah, very typical, huge event for children. Relatives would come visit and that sort of thing. Coddled and separated. Rather than 5 or 7 years old marking this transition as it has before, like transition out of childhood, a longer child became the cultural norm. However, there was still a shorter childhood in the lower classes who needed children to be part of the contributing to domestic life in some way. Girls, however, were often seen as women by all classes at age 10. So again, cut short because of their proximity to all of their womanly duties that they were expected to learn. With wife and mother at her station, girls had a lifelong domestic apprenticeship in their family of origin. So they would learn any sort of domestic skills from typically their mother, to learn how to be a wife and mother, which was what was expected of every girl. Philip Aries makes the comparison of the medieval street to an Arab street. He wrote this in 1960, so clearly Arab life is different than what it was then. But the comparison he wanted to make, for those of you who have traveled in other places, and this may sound familiar to you in some capacity or another, the private life and public life were not opposed to one another. The public life was an extension of your private life. Your work and your social relations mingled, right? Who you did business with the same people who were your friends and that sort of thing. It was all one life rather than a public life and a private life. If just like we have pictures on our calendars today, they had pictures on them then. And they took on new themes at this time in this transition. Rather than work or play or village life, right? This is our public world. It portrays women, neighbors, and child. The theme of the family was never so apparent previously. So suddenly we start having small communities that are emphasized. The public life is something more distant than our private life. The family portrait was once something that was done and given to churches. So because you were a benefactor and whatnot, you think in this pre-literate time, when you would donate something to the church, instead of having your name up there because you wanted everyone to know who donated it. Since very few could read, you would put your photo up there instead. But now the portrait becomes a secularized object in the home for the family to appreciate. Or I would question, does it then sanctify the home? Does having this picture and preserving this moment in time make the home a more beautiful and bountiful place, right? This is also, if you remember our Kuntz reading, this is hearkening back to our transition from house to home as well. And so then this fascination with the family arises at the same time that the realization of the child as a distinct, unique human being comes at the same time. So the discovery of the child is also a chance for people to emphasize the importance of family. Domestic church. We're going to talk about domestic church a little bit later. But if there were no clerics present, the children were expected to lead grace. And this brought together 3 themes: piety, religiosity and that sort of thing, childhood, and the family gathered at table. So these 3 things, children leading grace, really tied and cemented our notions of family, togetherness, at the table, holiness, all these things. And it really sanctified the family. It satisfied a need for piety. that people had that was neither public nor individual, but to have a family piety and to see the family as the smallest unit of church, which is what domestic church is. It's a Catholic teaching that the family is the smallest unit of church. And so this was kind of a family practice that would reinforce this idea. From the medieval family to the modern family, apprenticeship. Typically, women had their domestic apprentice, or girls had their domestic apprenticeship, so it took place in their home. But boys had to go out and learn a trade, which may not have been the family trade. Apprenticeship was a means of socializing the children in a home-like setting, without the true familiarity that might stunt the acquisition of the skill, right? If the dad told them what to do, there might be I don't want to, no, stop it. But with this other person, they were more likely to be more obedient and to see them as an expert, that sort of thing. But it wasn't, just throwing them out into the world of a means end sort of capitalist economy. It was very much under the care of a specific person who was invested as well in the child. So children, often, especially young boys, leaving their families at 7, the bond was very different. I don't know if you could even imagine when you were in 2nd grade leaving your family. It was, I can't wrap my head around that. But children were socially understood through their contributions to the family's common project. So at this point, the family was a moral and a social institution, not a sentimental institution, right? So this is the medieval family, coming together in partnership and work, being a social and moral institution, right? And then we start to see this transition to the sentimentalness of the 17th century, 16th century and beyond. And part of the changes that reinforce this is primogeniture. If you remember from Kuntz, that's just leaving everything to the firstborn son. Primogeniture is abolished. Either families were expected to divide it equally among the sons or equally among all children. Children began to be kept in their home instead of sending them to boarding school, if you afforded that, to day school. Rather than having them in a wet nurse in a village somewhere, they would bring the wet nurse to the home and keep their child in residence. Economic conditions changed so that families actually could withdraw from everyday life to the family, right? Rather than the family being a part of the economic life, the family was the retreat from the economic life. So because the social and work networks were no longer the same. The families were also seen as a social unit. Families often lived in, quote, big houses, just houses with many, many rooms, with large numbers of extended families and servants, depending on the class. And this was everybody. It wasn't that living in a big house was something that only the wealthiest could do. It was actually cheaper to build a big house rather than lots of little houses. If you were among the poorer people, you would have your extended family and it would be a big sort of clan type house. If you were wealthier, it might be your immediate family and some of your extended family, but with a lot of servants. These houses had strong and dense networks of sociability. People cared about the people they lived there, whether they were relatives or servants. They had a sense of care and investment for these people. I don't want to romanticize it. It wasn't that servants were totally equal to family members, not by any means, but there was they were not considered simply as workers as we would think of them today. Parents were always concerned with children, and never would parents after the 17th century console themselves that they could have another child to replace a deceased child, which was common prior to that. Parents saw the child as a part of family, as the future of their family, right? That they were an important part that would carry on their legacy, and their emotions and their values and their dreams. A modern family puts all of its energies into children, unconcerned with the good that this could bring to the family. The family exists for the children and is removed from this greater social fabric. And this is, hopefully these photos aren't too disturbing, but this was something that really came into rise in the 1800s with photography. If you could think about photography not being too common, right, and more expensive, 18 and 1900s, right, it was something that you would do on special occasions and events and that sort of thing, especially if you were poor, you wouldn't do it very often. But oftentimes this meant that a family would not have a portrait done, and a child would die and they would not have that child. And this was, if you can imagine, this was emotionally heart-wrenching for them to know that they would never see this child, never have a tangible thing to look at and remember this child by. So when a child died, these are called post-mortem photos. Actually, when adults would die too, they would sometimes do this. But very common with children, especially with children death being common and sometimes unpredictable. But so if we look here at this larger photo of the man, the woman, and the child, you can see that the child is not sleeping, although she looks as though she could be, but she's passed away. If you look at the photo on the upper right, you see that there's 5 children in a row, but the one in the back, the youngest, has passed. I don't know if you've ever seen like a doll stand. They would build them for children to adults so that they could stand up and kind of look more alive in their photos, and standing with their siblings. And then the bottom right-hand one is just looks like a teen who had passed, and she was done up quite lovely for her parents and other family and relatives to remember her by. All right, so we're going to kind of combine these 2 questions into one question, because the first question is really kind of like just a few bullet points sort of answer that you would give. And then the second aspect of the question is something that you could elaborate more. So understandings of childhood have varied across time and space. What are some really contemporary understandings of children, and how do these shape the family? And then, so think about just a few things. What are our contemporary understandings of family? What does that do to family? And what are some of the strengths and drawbacks to our contemporary understandings of children and their place in society? The new ways we have of understanding children affect us deeply. So what are the strengths and drawbacks to having the notions of childhood that we do? All right, now we're going to look at an article by Hayes called The Mommy Wars. A lot of this looking at the conflict of mothers kind of blaming one another if they work for neglecting their children, or if they stay at home for kind of demonizing women in the workplace and that sort of thing. So this is an examination of what's going on there behind that. The first thing that she points out is that there is an ideology of motherhood and an ideology of the market, and they are in conflict with one another. And the motherhood emphasizes care and nurturance, compassion, cooperation, that sort of thing, versus profit, efficiency, bottom line, that sort of market-based thing. So you can see how these 2 ideologies are totally incompatible with one another, is the way we understand them in the way we've constructed them in the United States today. This causes women to just not be able to do it. I should say mothers not being able to do it right. I guess not all women, because there's the childless woman. Women who decide not to have children and go all in on their career are seen as being selfish. Then there's the hardworking mom, the woman who decides to have kids and has her kids in a lot of daycare, so that she can really put energy into her work and at the same time have kids. She's seen as neglecting her children. There's the mom who tries to balance the 2 and have both be really invested in her career as well as being invested in her children, trying to meet both of those needs in a way that she can. And she's seen as being on the mommy track. So in other words, not taking her job very seriously, seeing it as something she does on the side. The stay-at-home mom, who does not work, is seen as stereotyped as being unproductive and useless. So women don't really have any sort of way to be socially affirmed in their choices. Intensive mothering is something that Hayes identified as something that the women that she interviewed shared. She interviewed both stay-at-home mothers and working mothers. And she found that both stay-at-home mothers and working mothers justify their choices to either stay at home or work as a desire to be a better mom. So intensive mothering governs both of their choices. Stay-at-home moms say they are needed by their kids, and that's why they've made the choice that they have to not work. Working mothers say that they have more patience when they do not have children full-time, and they consider themselves better mothers when they have a break from their kids and from home life in general. So both of them see themselves as being better mothers because of the choices they've made. Working mothers are twice as likely as stay-at-home mothers to say that home is more important than work, which is interesting. So we can see that mothering is a real priority for both of these groups of women. So that was a really brief look at that article. But the question that we're going to look at is, what are the social pressures that are unique to moms? You can go outside the article, of course. This is a super brief version of it. And then how are women negotiating them? And are they successful? So explore that a bit. In our final article for this mothering and childbearing children section, is looking at this article that notes that the U.S. is a very fertile place among developed countries. This is an article, I didn't put it in there, by Casper and Bianchi within an edited collection. Whoa, look at all those babies. I'd be laying down too if I had that many, huh? So yes, we have a lot more kids as far as Western industrialized countries go. So looking at this, they see that some cohorts postpone birth. Cohorts mean a group of people who were born together at the same time, share some sort of experience together, like millennials are a cohort. Some cohorts postpone births, but some have the same number of children. This causes artificial rises and falls in the birth rate. So when people say, "Oh, look at this moment," a lot of times when we study childbearing trends, we look at like the 70s. And we'll say, "Oh, look at it, there's a fall of births in the 70s." But what's actually happening is people some people had their children earlier. The older women did, and then the younger women who would have been expected to have children if they'd had children at the same time that the previous decade did, are postponing their children. So we actually are having about the same number of children. We're just, as cohorts go, we postpone them or have them earlier, depending. And so there's these artificial rises and falls in the birth rates when really things tend to be more consistent. Like, for example, in the 50s and 60s, women were having kids much earlier than previously. So we have to look at things as they argue from a cohort perspective as well, not just a period in time. More families have 2 children. There's a lot less variation than there was in the past. Before, some families would have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. Now people are really hovering very close to 2. There's more first births that we see now from 30 to 39-year-old women, and fewer first births from 20 to 30-year-old women. So we see women tend to be postponing it now. As far as pregnancy and marriage goes, 4% of married women chose to be childless. They elected to not have children, and that was in 1990, the statistic. But 80% of single women said the same. As far as going to the 1960s, more than half of conceptions led to marriage, right? People getting pregnant before they were married, more than half of them led to marriage. This dropped to 16% for teens and 31% for people in their 20s by 1990. There was a large gap between black and white women marrying after conception. 30% of white women married when they found out that they were pregnant versus 10% of black women. And in 1998, births to the unmarried make up 1/3 of births. That's a huge percentage, right? So in 1998, 1/3 of the children born were born to unmarried women. So that's a huge climb from before. Then the question that they raise, are kids dovetailing with or competing with career? This is a very interesting question, especially now with so many women in the workforce. Women who work during pregnancy are more likely to go back than those who stop during their pregnancy, and are more likely to go back during the first 3 months. 55% return to work by then. If you worked during your pregnancy, 55% return to work by the first 3 months of their child's life. Delayed childbearing is more likely to result in childlessness for the unchosen childlessness for the uneducated rather than the educated. It's difficult to say like what's the causality going on here. Um, so yeah, but just knowing that's going on, perhaps it is that delaying childbearing for the uneducated, they might have they might not have the financial access to fertility treatments and those sorts of things. Perhaps the educated are more aware of the documentation on biological clocks and that sort of thing, and are taking and are not delaying them to the point where they are worried about their own fertility. I have to look into that one a little further with what's going on. And looking at young men in pregnancy, young men have a lot of the same education, looking at the second bullet point, have very similar educational and economic vulnerability that young women do when they experience their first pregnancy. In the 50s, it was, being a young dad, you still had options. This was like a booming economy in the 50s. You could support your family on a high school education and that sort of thing. That is not the reality we live in today. So now young fathers have the same sort of economic vulnerability that women do. Men are less likely to financially support an unplanned child. A lot of young parents see cohabitation as an alternative to marriage. They say, I want to marry someone because I love them, not because I had a baby with them, but we can still live together and co-parent this child as best as we can and see where this takes us. And they call these fragile families among the low income because they are very tenuous. Financial stress can be a huge burden especially when you throw a new child into the mix among young people who maybe were not looking forward to missing out on that emerging adulthood phase of their life. Okay, so some questions we can look at here. I guess we're just going to look at the second one. Are there childbearing trends within this piece or elsewhere that you see as a concern? And are there trends that you find that are positive? So think about that, and then we'll discuss them in Zoom and online. All right, thanks.